good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to our expert Q&A digital event on how innovative trade funding can help least developed countries recover from COVID-19. I'm Violeta Gonzalez, Head of Partnerships, Communications, and Resource Mobilization at the Enhanced Integrated Framework, or EIF. EIF is a multilateral sustainable trade program at the World Trade Organization, bringing 51 developing countries, 8 international organizations, 24 government investors, and many other partners, all working towards a common goal: to build the capacity of least developed countries, or LDCs, and using trade for economic development and poverty reduction. The United Nations identifies 47 countries worldwide as least developed because of their structural impediments to development and low income. Many of these countries are in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This is EIF's first digital event exclusively focused on financing issues to support trade in the countries that need it the most. The COVID-19 pandemic brings more urgency than ever to this topic, as LDCs are among the hardest hit. The transaction costs of international trade for LDCs are rising due to supply chain disruptions, and LDCs face increasing troubles in accessing trade finance. Small and medium-sized businesses are suffering the most, and we are seeing a mounting debt problem at all levels. We know we must act now, and we must act differently. Can we use official development assistance to support trade better? Can we use other public sources of funding better? How can we effectively bring in the private sector to power up trade as part of resolving this crisis? And what innovative financing models are out there that could be used for trade in the COVID-19 recovery to achieve real impact? Today, I'm very much looking forward to conversations that will not only help answer these questions, but that hopefully will inspire the innovative financing tools and global partnerships needed to help LDCs recover from COVID-19. Now, before we deep dive into our program, just a few notes from me. We have designed today's event to be a very dynamic event, which we hope will help to cut through the Zoom fatigue experienced by so many of us across this year. But we first want to know who our audience is, so I invite you to participate in the poll appearing on your screen. Let us know which of the different categories best describes you. Throughout the event, there will be a graphic facilitator that will help us capture key messages and takeaways. But we also encourage you to share your messages and your takeaways with us on Twitter using our handle at EIF for LDCs. Hashtags for this event are Invest in Trade and Power Up Trade. And throughout the event, please also submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen so we can make the event as useful and interactive as possible. So please keep those questions coming. Now, there is live interpretation in French, and you might have seen the instructions at the beginning of the event. But it's also very important that you just select the language. So if you're joining via desktop, just click interpretation at the bottom of the screen and select your preferred language. It's really important you choose a language so that the event is as smooth as possible. Now, if you're joining via mobile, click More at the bottom of the screen, choose Interpretation, and select your preferred language. Now, finally, this event is hosted in partnership with the OECD, the World Bank Group, Bamboo Capital Partners, and ResponsAbility. And I want to thank our partners for helping make this event possible. With that, I'd love to introduce my colleague and our moderator, Michelle Kovacevic. A few words about Michelle. Michelle is incredibly passionate about bringing diverse groups of people together and making sure all voices that need to be heard to solve complex problems are heard. And Michelle will be doing just that today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, and enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Violeta, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you who are watching this event. We're so glad to have you with us today. And let's take a look at our poll results. I see that 76% of you have voted, and it looks like there's a great spread of diversity across all of the different categories. Most of us seem to be from international organisations with 37%, closely followed by LDC government officials, welcome, 23%, and then a good smattering of private sector, government, development practitioners, academics and students. So thank you all so much for joining and welcome. And I also know we have people joining us from across Africa, Asia, Latin America. And so it's great to have all of you participating and contributing to this conversation today. Before we get into today's program, let's take a look at a short video which provides an example of how supply chains and LDCs are currently being disrupted by COVID-19. This supply chain disruption is not just happening in Ethiopia. It's happening in Bangladesh, in Cambodia, in Burkina Faso, and it's disrupting hundreds of thousands of small and medium businesses. Our aim in today's conversations is to highlight the innovative financing solutions that will help these small businesses in LDCs to build back better from COVID. To kick us off today, I'm really excited to welcome Ratnakar Adhikari, who is the Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Ratnakar.
Thank you.
And so, wonderful, thanks so much. Ratnakar, I wanted to start today by talking to you a little bit about what you're hearing from LDCs. What have they been saying about the current state of financing for trade, given the impacts that COVID-19 is having on their economies?
Thank you very much, Michelle. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants who are participating. So in terms of what I'm hearing, based on my discussion with government leaders here in Geneva, as well as Geneva capitals, basically, LDCs already have low revenue to GDP ratio. They have limited fiscal space due to debt burden and limited volume of external financing. All this is likely to deteriorate further due to COVID-19 because of diversion of resources to address urgent public health priorities. In this context, I wish to highlight three major challenges. One is the decline in aid for trade. Some donors have already cut their aid for trade due to decline in gross national income, while others have maintained their overall level. And we do not know if any donor is willing to sort of increase this at this point in time. Some aid for trade is being diverted to public health priorities. And the second challenge that they have been mentioning to us, particularly during our informal conversation, is the increased gap in trade finance. Trade finance is a short-term credit, often filled by financial institutions which cover the risk of non-payment that is often needed for business of all sizes to export. The issuance of letter of credit is becoming even more difficult with the pandemic, which is disproportionately affecting small businesses. And the third challenge that I hear is the decline in foreign direct investment. Those LDCs that depend heavily on commodities, the downward spiral or volatility of major commodities such as copper in Zambia, oil in Angola, or textile in countries such as Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Myanmar that have resulted not only in a decline of exports, but also reduction in foreign direct investment. So these are essentially the challenges, Michelle.
Right. Yeah. Wow. And they're big challenges. And we will go into the topic of aid for trade in a bit more detail in our first panel discussion. So thank you for highlighting that, and ODA as well. So coming into the kind of the case for investment, why is it important, do you think, to invest in trade, particularly in LDCs?
Well, trade is a key driver of economic development and poverty reduction throughout the world. Let me remind you that no country has been able to achieve sustained growth of 7% without relying on trade. The 7% is a magical number that would allow a country to double its gross domestic product every decade. So every 10 years, so you can double your GDP. So therefore, it is fundamental. It is also critical for some of the LDCs to graduate out of the LDC group. So in the current situation, investing in trade is critical for a number of reasons. Let me start with how we can help LDCs to meet their development aspirations through trade. Trade contributes to increased revenue for the government, growth opportunities for businesses, employment opportunities, especially for women and youth, and help LDCs meet their sustainable development goals. In fact, many least developed countries such as Bangladesh, Laos, PDR, and Vanuatu have not only traded their way out of poverty, but also achieved their graduation aspiration because of trade. And secondly, building back better and faster. Those LDCs that have continued to invest in trade, for example, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Rwanda, Senegal, Vanuatu, despite the crisis, despite the pandemic, are likely to recover faster and build back better as their businesses rebuild, export revenues pick up, and jobs are retained or created. These are important for sustained recovery.
Yeah, thank you so much. And coming to EIF, how does the EIF support LDCs in financing for trade, given it's such an important thing?
Well, there are multiple ways through which we support. For example, over the past 11 years, EIF has deployed over $200 million to finance trade capacity building in LDCs. With these funds, we were able to leverage $100 million from LDC's government, development partners, as well as private sector. This has allowed LDCs to have greater access to international market for their goods and services. In 2020 alone, EIF has invested $19.2 million in 23 projects focused on trade, productive capacity building, institutional capacity building, as well as analytical studies that are considered crucial for COVID-19 recovery. And these include some of the impact assessment of COVID-19 on their development prospects, on their graduation prospects, on their prospects to increase their trade potential. These include projects focused on e-commerce, women economic empowerment, tourism, agribusiness development, and private sector development. Our ability to attract private finance so far has been limited to 3% of the total resources that we've been able to leverage, which we intend to ratchet up in days to come. Within this context, I would like to highlight 3 points. First and foremost is the foreign direct investment. If the government can design sound policies and attract FDI in green recovery, enhance participation in the global value chain, especially in the context of reshoring and nearshoring opportunities, and tap into new sources of growth, such as ICT and digital trade, they can achieve V-shaped recovery. Well, we are not supposed to use jargon, but let me explain what V-shaped recovery means. It's sudden decline and a rapid recovery. So that is going to be possible if they are able to attract foreign direct investment. So in this context, what EIF has done is to partner with World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, WIPA, and develop a capacity building program targeted to the IPAs, the investment promotion agencies, and trade ministry officials. And this would be rolled out in 20 LDCs from the first quarter of 2021, since we've already completed the groundwork for that. And that project, which was approved in January this year, has now been adopted to face the challenges brought about by COVID-19. Then the third and most important point, and which is going to be the focus of our discussion today, is the point relating to blended finance, innovative financing, and within that category, blended finance. A 2019 report from OECD and UN Capital Development Fund suggests that only 6% of the private finance mobilized by official development assistance benefits LDCs, and this is very low. The development community and private sector must be willing to experiment more and take more risk as LDCs work in challenging environment. However, we see three major challenges in LDCs. One is the challenge of what? Enhancing knowledge of LDCs on the potential of blended finance is something that we could potentially do. Second is to help LDCs to find where such opportunities exist. That's the where one. And the third one is how. Connecting, and how can be described as follows: connecting LDCs to such opportunities and helping them create conducive domestic environment. When I say conducive domestic environment, that includes the necessary policy, legislation, and institutional apparatus that is required to take advantage of this opportunity. So to help LDCs overcome these challenges, international support, including the support from the EIF, is going to be critical.
That's
I'm
great.
looking forward to the conversation today, hoping that these will inspire new partnerships and action in delivering financing at scale for LDCs in the countries that need, or the countries that need it the most during these challenging times.
Thank you so much, Ratnakar. And you've really, I think, given a great overview and a great highlight of some of the key issues that we're going to be delving deeper into in our two panels today. And I know this is a very quick one, but it's really great to have you participate, and we really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So before we go into our first panel for today, I'd like to spotlight on our graphic facilitator, who has, as Violetta mentioned at the beginning, is illustrating the conversations that we're having today and has been capturing what we've been discussing in Ratnakar's session. So it'd be great to have a look at what she's been capturing so far. It seems like we've got some great challenges outlined here in a big globe that needs to build back better, and we've already started to go into the issue of blended finance, which we'll definitely dive deeper into. That's great. We'll be revisiting this this sketchboard later on in the session today. So we're now going to move on to our first panel on the impact of COVID-19 on official development assistance and aid for trade. This is a topic that is really important because we know that ODA and aid for trade represents a critical funding stream for trade development in LDCs. And I know many of you will be very interested in knowing the latest on this topic. So we will be taking questions from you, the audience, about ODA and aid for trade towards the end of this panel. So please do make sure you type your questions in our Q&A chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our panel today. We have Yasmin Ahmad, who is the Manager of Data Collections and Disseminations at the OECD. And we have Louise Kanyonga, the Chief Strategy and Compliance Officer from the Rwanda Development Board. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have this rockstar panel of women to help kickstart our event. Hello, Yasmin. Hello, Louise.
Hi, Michelle.
Morning.
Great. So I'm going to ask you the first question, Yasmin. So I know that you've been very busy at the OECD over the past few weeks, and you've been analysing the impact of COVID-19 on official development assistance and aid for trade. We'd love if you could summarise for us what you have found from your latest surveys.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I have a presentation and I will be talking to this presentation, so I hope you can all see it on screen. I can see it. So as Michelle mentioned, I work at the OECD where I manage the data collections on official development assistance. And what we have been doing in the past couple of weeks and months is looking on the impact that the current crisis can have on official development assistance. So today, as we all know, we face our greatest global challenge in living memory, and there is a very lively debate in international development assistance and the international development community about the outlook for ODA in 2020 and 2021. And most of us are, of course, asking ourselves whether ODA budgets will increase, whether they will stay stable, or perhaps be cut against the backdrop of this unprecedented global recession that the world now faces. Now, in recent months, what we have seen is that countries are taking extraordinary policy and financing actions domestically. And what we have attempted to do is to take a longer view based on the 60 years of data that we have at the OECD and look back to see what history tells us about ODA flows. Now, while the current situation is, of course, unprecedented, looking back over 60 years of data, we have found that ODA has charted its own path, and despite economic crises, and it has remained the most resilient development finance flow. From the oil crises in the 70s to the debt crisis in the 80s and global recession in the 90s, the financial crisis of the late 2000s, ODA has continued to be resilient. And we believe that there are certain takeaways from the past 6 decades which are still pertinent today. Next slide, please. So first, ODA is the most stable external resource flow for developing countries. It is just one source of development financing and by no means the largest, but as you can see from this chart, unlike private flows and unlike official support for development, official support for development has been the most consistent resource for developing countries in recent decades. This dependability facilitates long-term planning and helps smooth economic shocks. Second, we know that the need for concessional development finance like ODA is and will continue to be great in the coming years. External flows to low and middle income countries are projected to drop by $700 billion in 2020. And OECD projections indicate that even in the most optimistic scenario, global foreign direct investment will drop by at least 30%, with flows to developing countries likely falling more strongly. Remittances also, which have been a stable and growing source of foreign income for developing countries until earlier this year, could fall by $100 billion. And finally, domestic pressures will erode tax revenues, which were already insufficient. Developing countries rely on ODA and other public finance mechanisms. Of course, we know that the human toll could be severe. The most extreme forecast is that 500 million people could fall back into poverty as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And already existing inequalities in health and societies are being exacerbated. The number of people facing acute food security is likely to double too. Next slide, please. So at the same time, past trends show that there has been a limited correlation between gross domestic product, or GDP, and official development assistance. So if ODA has been resilient to economic crises and not closely related to GDP growth, then what are the likely factors that actually drive it? Well, in the first instance, politics. Political leadership, global mobilization, and commitments drive ODA. And this was clear in the early 2000s when a series of international agreements drove ODA commitments to rise. ODA trends to health and the social protection also stem from strong political will. The most generous decade in the history of ODA, which is from 2001 to 2010, was no exception for ODA to the health sector, which was spurred by 3 health-related Millennium Development Goals and commitment by G8 countries in 2000 to combat 6 specific diseases. By 2010, international cooperation was driving the expansion of social protection to low-income countries. The further expansion in social protection programs coincided with the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, as well as fuel and food crisis when social protection programs were introduced and expanded. These examples speak to the critical counter-cyclical role of ODA, as well as its ability to invest strategically and take greater risk to build systems that improve country resilience. Could I ask for the next slide, please? So looking at aid for trade disbursements to LDCs, these have amounted to a total of $108.4 billion since the initiative started in 2006. Disbursements have increased by an average annual rate of 13.3% over this period to reach $13.5 billion in 2018. An additional $3 billion in aid for trade related other official flows was provided together with $500 million in private finance that was mobilized through official sector interventions. However, less than 10% of private finance mobilized by official development finance benefits LDCs. Getting blended finance to work for LDCs requires that the development community is willing to take more risks to work in challenging environments, and it requires ensuring that blended transactions align with national priorities and respect national ownership and form part of a broader SDG financing strategy. However, promoting the use of blended finance should not lead to a decline in overall share of development finance received by LDCs. Next slide, please. This ODA has helped LDCs elaborate trade development strategies. So as you can see here on this slide, in 2018, 2% of total aid, or $242 million, went to negotiate or implement trade agreements. 59%, representing $8 billion, contributed to generating energy or building roads, ports, telecommunication networks to better connect domestic firms to regional and global markets. 39%, or $5.2 billion, supported the private sector in exploiting their comparative advantages and diversifying their trade. And less than $0.8 million helped countries pay for the costs associated with trade liberalization. Other official flows and private investment mobilized through official interventions for the LDCs are mainly focused on improving access to finance and other business services. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean for ODA in 2020 and beyond? Will ODA budgets rise and meet the needs to create the COVID-19 crisis? Will budgets hold steady at recent levels despite the global slowdown in growth? Or will budgets decline in line with contracting economies? What we think we'll see is probably a mixed impact on ODA across countries, and it's impossible to really tell how ODA will look in the coming years. Nevertheless, we have seen strong statements of support for ODA maintenance or increase from many representative bodies, with some actors taking swift action to directly raise budgets or create fiscal space for developing countries through debt repayment moratoriums. These are actually hopeful signs that ODA budgets could rise or could hold steady to withstand the COVID-19 crisis. For example, the United States has committed over $2 billion in 2 emergency supplemental appropriations, and Germany has committed an additional 3 billion euros by 2021 to its international spending. Norway and several other donors have recently also announced that despite COVID-19 and the crisis, it was proposing that its aid budget for 2020 be maintained without any cuts. To hold ODA levels steady, providers will need to actively raise the proportion of gross national income, or GNI, that they provide as ODA to counteract global contraction. In 2019, the volume of net ODA flows was equal to 0.29% of gross national income of all DAC members combined. Now, if countries maintain their 2019 volumes of net ODA in 2020, then the total ODA as a share of DAC countries' GNI would need to rise to 0.32% to offset the drop in GNI. Now, if DAC providers of development cooperation decide to provide the same shares of GNI in 2020 as they did in 2019, then net ODA levels could fall by between $11 billion and $14 billion according to our estimates. Next slide, please. To obtain more evidence on how the crisis has impacted the development cooperation picture, the OECD ran 2 specific surveys this year. The first one in March at the beginning of the onset of the crisis, and the most recent one in October. And what the results have shown is that many members of the Development Assistance Committee have indicated that their response to the crisis was guided in the short term in managing the spread and consequences of the virus, as well as supporting developing countries to prepare and respond to the pandemic. Some members indicated that in the medium term, they would focus on making diagnostics and vaccines available to the poorest countries with weak health systems. And many also indicated that they would support developing countries by tackling economic, social, and political effects of the pandemic. Many respondents noted that their 2020 programs had been reoriented, and in some cases, new resources had been mobilized. So far, what we know is that DAC countries have collectively committed about $12 billion in 2020 for the COVID-19 response. And within this total, $5 billion have been reprogrammed, and $7 billion are additional funding to be spent in 2020 and thereafter, although not all of this may be ODA money. And so far, in 2020, about $6 billion have actually been dispersed. So in addition to a moratorium on loan repayments, some loans to developing countries would be rescheduled to provide additional fiscal space. And the OECD estimates that the debt standstill stemming from DAC members to the poorest countries could be between $1.5 billion and $3 billion. Now, while coordination at national and international levels were found key in mounting a coherent response, many members indicated that possible delays to programming and monitoring and evaluation activities due to the crisis. These findings raise the pressing issue of trade-offs that many development cooperation actors have been forced to make. The surveys are a snapshot of responses and capture the type of political will to respond to the crisis that is so crucial now. But it also gives us a sense of actions rather than results, and as time goes on, the OECD will focus further research on difficult decisions that the ODA community will be faced with. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin, for presenting that really interesting data that paints a much more, I guess, complex picture than it may seem if one interacts with just, say, one donor and thinks that is the kind of indicative of the response of the community. And I know that there's probably going to be a lot of questions in our audience. So please, if you do have a question for Yasmin, do type it into our Q&A chat box and we will come back to it after we've had a bit of a chat between Yasmin and Louise. But I'd like to now come over to you, Louise, and hear a bit about the Rwandan response. So given that development agency funding represents about 65% of financing for development in LDCs, I know that might not be the case in Rwanda, and it'd be interesting to hear from you where what percentage mix ODA makes up now in Rwanda. How might the scenarios that Yasmin just presented, how might they impact the development of trade in Rwanda?
Thank you very much, Michelle. First of all, let me just say how pleased I am to join this first virtual event of the EIF, and really for this very important discussion on looking at the impacts of COVID on development finance, but also some of the innovative approaches that we could use to mitigate those impacts. Now, as you said, and I think it's very clear from Yasmin's presentation that COVID-19 has indeed put development finance at stake, however nuanced that might be. And as the ED said earlier, it's compounded by the fact that it's coming at a time when, this impact on development finance is also coming at a time when domestic resources such as tax revenue are also being greatly hit by the impacts of the pandemic. Looking at the Rwandan perspective, as you rightly said, Michelle, the situation or the scenario in Rwanda is slightly different. Development finance still plays a very critical role, obviously, but our reliance on ODA has steadily declined in the last decade. In the financial year of 2018-2019, just to give you a sense, our development was mostly financed by domestic resources to the tune of about 61%. And the remaining 30% financed by external flows. Of those external flows, development finance accounted for about 27%. So it is still obvious, that development assistance still accounts for a lot more than foreign private capital or remittances. This is a challenge we're working on to address, because it's very important for us as we seek to build self-reliance of our country. But looking at how we've responded to this, even prior to the pandemic, the government of Rwanda has been very keen on diversifying our sources of finance to support the development of the country, specifically for the key development imperatives such as trade, because this is very important for us to look at how we can reduce our vulnerability to any external shocks, but also just overall reduce our dependency. And some of the things that the ED said absolutely resonate with the approach that Rwanda has taken. We've really focused on facilitating and building a very conducive framework to attract increased FDI, domestic investment, and even public-private partnerships. And so Rwanda has very bold and comprehensive business environment reforms that we've put in place, and I'll touch on those later. We've also, been very proactive and very targeted with the investments that we try to attract in the country, starting from a point where we really understand what priority sectors are going to drive growth, and then proactively reaching out to investments in those sectors. To support that, we've also been very, very keen on increasing our tax revenues, leveraging, very much on the benefits of automation to make it easier to pay taxes. And we've seen a huge increase in tax contributions in that sense. And also looking at, implementing other strategic investment projects that are really going to drive economic transformation. And so, when you look at these scenarios against the background of Rwanda and what we have been trying to build, over the last few decades, it would obviously be a positive relief for developing economies to see an increase in in ODA assistance, especially given the impacts of COVID-19 on increased poverty levels, which we really do see a similar trend here in Rwanda. But these positive outcomes will only be realized if we're able to utilize this assistance very wisely, make sure that it comes in and has a very long-term perspective on sustainable impact, and importantly, that it is very much aligned with what our national development priorities are, and these are clear: increased trade, job creation, private sector development. So we have to always make sure that, we're keeping our eye on that. If the ODA levels stagnate or decrease, inevitably the pressure will be much higher on LDCs and developing economies. But we look at it as something that could be potentially positive, because it will push us to rapidly adapt and find smarter long-term solutions that will build our self-reliance. And so, just to conclude, Michelle, I think for countries like Rwanda, regardless of what happens, with the ODA and how the scenarios play out, it's going to be very key for us to implement strategies to finance trade and development that are diverse, that are sustainable, and that build up long-term resilience.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. And I hear that diversity is really key in being resilient as a country to weather these kind of shocks. And so I'm really keen to come back to that in our second panel discussion and really dig into how Rwanda has done that, how you have diversified, and what lessons that might bring up for other LDCs. But before we go there, I'd like to ask the both of you, what do you feel has to change in terms of the management of ODA? How could governments, both donor countries and LDCs, better put to use ODA assistance? Maybe Yasmin, do you want to start us off here?
I think I'll be very brief here, and it kind of ties into what Louise was saying, is that I think predictable outcomes must be secured for ODA flows. And this is even more so in light of a crisis like this, when certain countries are still heavily dependent on concessional financing. And as I mentioned in my presentation, this really depends on and is key on national commitments, political will, leadership, and global mobilization to ensure that the flows remain steady. So I think that is key in this, and that will ensure predictable outcomes for developing countries.
Thanks, Yasmin. What about you, Louise? What do you think needs to change?
Thanks, Michelle. I think this is actually being touched on by both the ED and Yasmin. I think for us, really, the starting point is that any effective ODA will have to build on be built on a level of mutual respect and partnership. And both developing countries and developing partners need to really have the same focus that is ultimately aligned to what the national priorities and needs are, and not to any external agenda. And for this, there has to be very strong ownership, from both parties. And building from there, you can look at how you ensure that this development assistance is channeled towards sustainability, it's channeled towards what the drivers of growth are going to be. And for Rwanda, very important for us is really looking at the fact that ODA should increasingly strengthen the private sector. It's going to be very key that those partnerships are leveraged on, both in terms of looking at how to mobilize the private sector to also come in to contribute to development outcomes, but also how ODA assistance is really going to support SMEs, farms, and other players in the private sector, because that is the only way that we are going to be able to achieve any sort of sustainable growth. So any ODA that comes in either to de-risk investments or to build the capacity and the potential of the private sector is going to be very welcome. But just to conclude, Michelle, just very generally, very important to have those partnerships and mutual respect. Very important for us to also start looking at how we drive efficiencies. If we're looking at bringing in the private sector, I think that both governments and the development community can really learn from how quickly the private sector takes decisions. And this is something that we can also incorporate into ODA and into government. And then lastly, how do we make sure that we have platforms that enable dialogue and accountability between developing countries and development partners? And this is something we do very much in Rwanda. We have working groups between the development community and the government. We have regular sessions where we discuss progress. Has there been impact on development outcomes? What needs to be done better? And how do we continue to move together in the same direction?
Amazing. Thanks, Louise. And that topic of blended finance that you've so greatly foreshadowed, we'll cover that in the next panel in greater detail. Thank you. We're going to now take some questions from our audience. And the first question is coming to you, Yasmin, and hopefully this may not be within your remit to answer, but I will throw it your way anyway. So we've got a question saying, does the OECD plan to cooperate with China, which has already controlled the virus successfully?
So that question is a little bit out of my remit. I work in statistics and data, and we collect information from DAC members, which are the committee that reports to us, and for which reporting on DAC statistics, which is official development assistance, but also other official flows and private flows is mandatory. But we do receive voluntary reporting from a number of non-DAC countries and providers and international organizations, but we do not receive any data from China. There are numerous reasons for this. However, we do have estimates that we have on their cooperation, and we obtain these estimates mostly from published information that is published by the Chinese government. So that's so far as I can answer that question.
Thank you so much. Louise, we've got a question here asking about diversifying, and if you could go into a little more detail. So it's very important, of course, to diversify finance beyond ODA, and you mentioned in your response tax increases. The person from the audience is asking, how does the population react to this? Tax isn't a very popular issue, so how does the government actually, I guess, sell that to the population?
Oh, thanks, Michelle. That's a great question. And I think very important to clarify that. So we've been able to increase our tax, contribution, not because we've increased the level of taxes or, the taxes that the private sector has to contribute or the general population. How we've been able to achieve that is just being more efficient in terms of our tax collection and really closing any loopholes and any gaps, and also really engaging very strongly with our private sector. So the tax administration has a lot of advocacy and engagement with the private sector community, but also because we've just made it so easy to pay taxes using automation to have online platforms, mobile phone-based, platforms to make your tax payments, and also really simplifying the regulations around it. So it's been more about efficiencies, that has driven increased contribution rather than increasing the taxes that are payable. So I hope that makes it clear.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. As a question for the both of you, I think, to address, and obviously this situation is worrying particularly for debt-stressed LDCs. Could you tell us, both of you, and we'll start with you, Yasmin, what are some of the flexible mechanisms that donors have introduced in ODA COVID support?
I think one of the flexible mechanisms, and this is what we've seen in responses to our surveys, is that donors are actually being very flexible in implementing programs as well. I mentioned that they were reprogramming certain programs. There are a number of programs that cannot take place because of the pandemic, such as bringing students in donor countries to study, or sending experts abroad because of travel restrictions and difficulties in the spot, and volunteer programs are also temporarily stopped. So the money that this spending would have been spent on is actually used for other programs and is being reoriented mostly for the COVID response, and that constitutes about $5 billion, what we've seen reported so far in 2020. So that's some of the flexibility. What we also know is that through the responses to the survey is that donors are also being extremely flexible with the way that they operate with their local civil society partners in supporting them, in providing funds where is needed, and in just having this working in more innovative ways in order to overcome and help support local actors during this crisis.
Thanks, Yasmin. And Louise, has that been your experience with the donors that provide ODA to Rwanda? Have they been more flexible, and have you seen that in the case of, in Rwanda?
Absolutely. I think, as Yasmin said, we've seen, very tremendous, support. And really, I think one of the things that we've seen from the COVID, because of its global impact, is that there's really been a resounding, collectiveness, in the sense that we're in this together. And so we've seen the same response from ODA, where it's really been reoriented, towards some of the social protection mechanisms that we put in place to help the most vulnerable, but then also looking at, channeling some of the resources just to drive recovery, in the economy. And this is, from direct support to farms that have been affected through an economic recovery fund that we've been able to mobilize, resources from development, from the development community, but also, going directly towards government to support in the different programs and initiatives. So we've seen a very strong collective will, to support developing economies in addressing, the immediate impacts of the economy, and now even moving towards discussions around how do we start looking at the medium term and the longer term effects, and how again do we mobilize, development assistance to deal with that. So I think, absolutely, we're seeing a similar reaction here in Rwanda, and it has been very, very valuable in helping us weather the crisis.
Thank you so much, Louise and Yasmin. We're going to have to move on now onto our next panel, but I really want to take a moment to thank you so much for being part of this panel. It's been great to hear both of your perspectives, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So before we move on to our next panel, I'd like to check in with our graphic facilitator and see what's been captured so far. If we can spotlight our sketchboard, please. Hopefully there was a very rich discussion there, and I think there'll be lots to capture. So hopefully all of you, our audience, can see this. We've got some wonderful graphs here of the sort of scenarios that might be at play, and the role of development assistance as well in this. And you can see someone juggling lots of balls in the air, which is absolutely the case for so many countries at the moment. And we hope that where we go next in our panel conversations might help that ball juggling to be a little bit easier on countries. So we are now going to move into our second and final panel. which is going to delve deeper into the opportunities that are offered by impact investment and blended finance to support trade in LDCs. So once again, we will be taking questions from you on this topic towards the end of the panel. So do make sure you type your questions in our Q&A chat box. Now, I'm aware there's probably more questions than we'll have time to answer today. So don't be disheartened. We will be seeking to answer your questions via email after this event. So please do still ask them, even if we don't get time to answer them in today's event. So it's my pleasure to go ahead and welcome our panelists for this investment and impact investment and blended finance conversation. We have Jean-Philippe Desquevrel, founder and managing partner at Bamboo Capital Partners. We've got Christian Regnicoli, head of institutional clients at ResponsAbility Investments. We're welcoming back the wonderful Louise Kanyonga, chief strategy and compliance officer at the Rwanda Development Board. And we're also joined by Armin Zaman Khan, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Ramoni. So welcome to you all. We're going to get straight into it. And my first question is for you, Jean-Philippe, if you can hear me and see me. So Jean-Philippe, you're considered to be, if I may say so, one of the global pioneers of impact investment. And while it's a concept that has been around for some time, it is still a new concept for many people. Could you give us a quick explanation of what impact investment is and the opportunity that it offers LDCs to grow their trade capacity and recover from COVID?
Well, I'll do my best. This is quite a difficult question to answer in 30 seconds. But essentially, you know, I know that terms can be confusing, but maybe a minute about it. Responsible investing is essentially saying I'm going to invest in companies or in industries that do not provoke any harm, meaning, you know, oil exploration, deforestation, weapons. That's responsible investing. Sustainable investing is to say, not only do I exclude things that can be harmful to the environment, to people and to the planet, but I'll try to invest in companies that do respect their stakeholders, that are properly governed and do take care about social and environmental issues. And then impact investing is going one step even further, and it's really being intentional and proactive in its investment decisions to provoke change, positive change that you want to see happen. So it's investing in chains of hospitals. It's investing in the dissemination of clean technology. It's investing in access to education. So really, impact investing is defined by the intentionality of behind the investments. And what can it do to LDCs? Well, many good things, right? Because, you know, investing for impact in LDCs brings and helps build the local infrastructure, help grow SMEs, delivering essential goods and services to poor people and low-income population. And those SMEs, by the way, can be export related. If you think that in most of the countries, 70 to 80% of the jobs are being created by SMEs, well, supporting SMEs through impact investing not only preserves jobs, but creates jobs. And that's very important in times, especially in times of crisis and COVID-19, as we see it. And then the last thing I would say is if there's one thing we have also learned in the COVID-19 situation is to say that technology and digitalization of access to services is becoming really important. I mean, if you can get access remotely to healthcare services, to education, to financial services, that can prove very useful in times of crisis like the ones we're now in here. So in a nutshell, impact investing very positive for LDCs and certainly for export-related sectors.
And it's a huge market opportunity, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure what the latest valuation is of the impact investment market, but it's quite large. That's the case, isn't it?
It is when you look. I mean, I don't have any number to give you because it's just huge. Think about the sustainable development goals that we need to achieve in only a decade. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling, but we can do it, and we can do it specifically if we put into practice tools such as and approaches such as blended finance, as we are going to speak about in a minute, I suppose.
Great, thank you. Coming to you now, Christian. I'd love if we could illustrate impact investment with a couple of examples. So could you give us one or two examples of how impact investment is supporting the development of sustainable agriculture or clean energy or financial inclusion in LDCs, perhaps where responsibility works?
More than happy to do that. Thanks, Michelle. So I think financing microfinance institutions and SME banks is very important, because with this financing, we reach out to the partners, the micro entrepreneurs and the SME companies. And this is really important to include as well the ongoing population, which helps at the end in expanding business and hence increased economic activity in these countries. So as an example, what we are doing of financing, we are financing a microfinance institution in Cambodia, which is called PROSOC. And with our financing, they are now reaching over 400,000 micro borrowers. So they're giving them access to finance, providing them credit and saving. And because of this new financing for the micro borrowers, they can now pursue business opportunities, which was not possible before because they had a lack of credit score or securities. And these microfinance institutions, because there's so much demand, they have grown over 30% over the last year. And they want to further expand to become a fully fledged retail and SME bank. And as Jean-Philippe mentioned before, SMEs are crucial because these are the companies really providing jobs. And even PROSOC in Cambodia, they're providing currently 7,600 jobs. But another sector which is very important is the agricultural sector, because in the agricultural sector, we intend to decrease the high level of poverty in the rural areas by supporting the sustainable agriculture companies which are sourcing from smallholder farmers. And they employ local workers, protect the local environment. And this in the long term will strengthen as well the agriculture value chain to the benefit of all the local economies. And I think especially for the LDCs, the agricultural sector is important because over 1/3 of the population works in the agricultural sector. So our aim is really to increase the income of the smallholder farmers. And we do that by training them on specialty products like specialty coffee, traceable coffee, or certified organic coffee. And we're doing this by financing international SMEs, traders, because they can provide these smallholder farmers access to markets. But these traders, they face challenges. So take as an example an SME, organic coffee trader. In order to source the organic specialty coffee, they need to pay advances to the smallholder farmers. So they pay $10 now and then $10 after. And they need to provide trainings to the smallholder farmers how to really do sustainable organic coffee. They need to make sure producers maintain the parcels, use the right fertilizer as well. And it's just different than just buying coffee and selling it. So for an SME, the trader is by far a bigger engagement with the smallholder farmers, which is as well more costly. And to cover this cost, I mean, he doesn't get the credit from the local bank to grow his business because he has not enough guarantees. Normally the banks, they're asking for a guarantee, they're taking the plant as a guarantee, but these are the limitations for the exporters. So, but they need working capital in order to expand. And what we are doing at ResponsAbility, here we step in and we pre-financing these harvests. So we're giving a small loan or a big loan, but maybe for 6 to 9 months in order to enable these companies to pre-financing the harvest. And to give you an example, one example is Great Lakes is a coffee processor and a coffee trader, which was founded, I think, back in 1999 in Uganda. And we are financing these SME companies, these traders, since 2014, because back then the company was expanding their exports. And thanks to our technical assistance, we obtained that this kind of Great Lake company, the trader, obtained the Alliance certification, the Rainforest Alliance certification, so be organic. And this allowed as well the company to increase the purchase from smallholder farmers and reach out to more markets. So between 2016 and 18, the export volume of this trader, of the certified coffee, has grown 4-fold and its export value more than tripled. Important is to know as well that Great Lakes is not just exporting, because they're building community wet mills, creating access to finance, provide training to farmers. It's very important that they introduce added value processing on the ground and not just exporting the raw material, because developing agriculture value chain by adding value locally is so important. So they really develop the local infrastructure. And by certifying smallholder farmers, these farmers, they're getting a premium and hence have higher income and are more resilient as well to the commodity price shock we have seen back 4 years. So these are just 2 examples how we create impact in order to foster trade by investing for inclusive growth.
Great, thanks, Christian. And I mean, there's some great examples there. Coming to you, Louise, I'd love to hear how Rwanda is responding to the opportunity that's offered by impact investment. And I found the number, a 2020 survey of the world's leading impact investors estimates the impact investment market at 715 billion. Now, that is 5 times the size of ODA from DAC countries right now. So the opportunity is huge. Has the Rwandan government been enacting any measures to better attract impact investment to the country?
Thanks, Michelle. So I think Rwanda, we've really started building the foundations to attract meaningful investments generally, over a decade ago. And we've consistently and very steadily built an environment that is conducive for this. So one that is politically stable, very economically sound, but importantly, that has really prioritized maintaining this, conducive business environment that can be able to quickly adapt to private sector need. And as Yasmin said earlier, this has really hinged for us on a very high level of political will, with a very strong and visionary leadership that we have. And, coming from, Rwanda's background, which I think you all know, it was really important for us to make sure that we consolidated, good governance, safety, security, all of which are really starting points for you to attract any kind of investment, leave alone, impact investment. So in terms of what we've done around the business environment specifically, which we think is such a fundamental starting point, we've had a very comprehensive doing business reforms program, looking at across the board reforms, from regulatory reform, institutional reform, automation and digitization, all to make it easy to do, business and to invest in Rwanda. Institutions such as the RDB where I work were established specifically just to create a one-stop shop for business and investment, so that you're offering a seamless experience, to any investments into the country. And because of all of this, today Rwanda is the second easiest place to do business in Africa. And even beyond that, because of the strong governance that I mentioned earlier, as well as the very sound macroeconomic stability, we've built a track record, as a country that delivers results, that is very accountable to results and to impact the livelihoods of its citizens. I think the UN has recognized Rwanda as one of the most improved nations when it comes to human development, across the board, from health to education, and even the improvement in terms of incomes of the citizens. So all of this really makes it a very important foundation to be able to crowd in investment that is looking to create impact, or to ensure that they're coming in and bringing a response to development challenges. And speaking specifically, though, we've obviously noted, that there's this growing trend even within the private sector, within the investment community, to want to impact change, while at the same time, obviously, still bringing in returns, being profitable, but really wanting to be a response to the societal issues. And so based on, this growing trend, we're also currently re-engineering some of our regulatory frameworks so that we can actually facilitate these, types of impact investments even further. For instance, we are currently reviewing our investment code, and within that, we've introduced specific tax incentives for impact investments, and investors who are coming in, to respond to a societal need. We're also currently developing a startup act and policy that will help innovative early stage companies that again are coming in to respond, to a societal challenge, to find a conducive environment, but also put in place incentives that will allow impact investors, or that will attract impact investors to invest in these type of early stage societal motivated companies. And then finally, we're also reviewing our company law currently to provide a regulatory framework just for social enterprises, and part of this will also include some tax incentives. So we're really looking at building from the macro fundamentals that have been put in place, now really narrowing in on some very specific interventions that would be able to crowd in more impact type of investments and more impact businesses as well.
Wow, exciting time in Rwanda. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. I'd like to go from the kind of the government level down to the small business level, and we're very excited to have Armin, who is our small business representative, with us today on the panel. Armin, can you tell us what changes your business has had to undertake to be ready to receive impact investment?
Thank you, Michelle, for asking me your question and for having me on this amazing panel. So before I go into that, I would like to give a small introduction to my startup. So I'm the founder of a beauty tech startup in Bangladesh named Ramani, which is a full stack platform that enables women micro-entrepreneurs in the beauty and lifestyle space to start, run, or grow their businesses without any additional investment. So we actually started off as an Uber-like system for booking beauty services from independent beauty experts and salon owners all over the 2 major cities in Bangladesh. So our app makes it really easy for customers to get standardized services at the comfort of their homes from the best service providers in town. So ours was actually the first platform of its kind in Bangladesh that allowed women skilled in the beauty and lifestyle sector to start their business without any additional capital. Something that was quite difficult before because the capital required to start a physical salon is quite a lot, and nobody wants to take home services from unverified service providers. A few months into we had started, our women micro-entrepreneurs themselves they started asking questions regarding how can we provide them with extra support for growing their businesses through small loans for bikes, better branded products and equipments, so they can also hire and train more people, etc. And these women have never owned even a bank account before. So that's when we realized that we're not only a profit-focused business, but also a venture that is already creating impact through our business model. We can use technology and data to give these women access to finance and opportunities they never had before. We have already received grant funding for creating new impact-focused products within our business, but in order to be able to pitch to impact investors and receive impact investments as equity, we have to clearly define a few key parameters, some of which are, number one, what is our product and how exactly we're solving the problem of access to meaningful employment among underprivileged women. Number two is that how can we actually redefine our key business performance KPIs to reflect the impact among our beneficiaries. So for example, previously our key KPIs were the bottom line numbers, like what is our GMV, what is our revenue, what is the number of customers every quarter, etc. And what is our growth rate. So now we have added parameters like the number of new women micro-entrepreneurs being registered every quarter, what is the increase in income per active entrepreneur, what is the amount of loan requested, etc. So in short, we have to define what is the impact that we're creating and the goals, and how we are meeting those goals in order to achieve what we want for our beneficiaries. And also we have to redefine how we report our numbers through a well-defined impact matrix. So these are the key changes we have to undertake in order to prepare ourselves for receiving impact investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Armin. That's great to hear. And wouldn't it be a better world if all of the businesses had to measure the way that they're benefiting livelihoods by doing business? I think that's a great thing to be aspiring to. I'd love to move us now to the topic of blended finance. So as we heard in our earlier panel, blended finance is when a government invests aid money in a project and that then triggers the private sector to feel confident to invest in that project. So Jean-Philippe, I'm going to come to you. Let's be real here. What level of public funds would it take to attract significant private sector investment into LDCs? And how is your company, Bamboo Capital Partners, innovating in this space?
So blended finance, as you said, is quite a simple concept. You're using, public money or private philanthropy to go in what is called the first loss tranche of a financial product, taking the first risk of investment, and thereby de-risking and catalyzing the private sector coming on top. Now, typically in those products, you would have a ratio of, $1 of public money or private philanthropy attracting $3 to $4, dollars of private sector investors. So you do the maths, right? Whatever the amount of capital you want to attract to the least developed countries or emerging markets, you divide by 3, and that's the number of ODA money or private philanthropy you want to put in first loss tranches of funds, so that you get to the number that you want to attract. Now, it's going to take time, of course, and blended finance is a fantastic tool, very efficient for both, in my opinion, for the public sector, because, as I said, every dollar you put, at risk triggers an additional 3 or 4 going in the sector, or dealing with a problem that you want to address. And for the private sector, of course, you're de-risked, and so you can tap into a larger pool of investment opportunities in emerging and frontier markets. Now, that's not the end of it, right? Blended finance is great, but once you have the money, you still need to find the deals. And if you want to stay true to your mission and find all those wonderful SMEs that are, small scale and early stage, it's a huge amount of work. And this is where partnership with large organizations such as international NGOs or UN agencies with hundreds and thousands of people on the ground, having operated for decades in those countries, and being able to not only identify deals for you, but monitor them and possibly bring technical assistance to help them, is actually very powerful. So on top of blended finance, we believe that partnership with large organizations and non-for-profit organizations is actually very, very, very powerful. And then last but not least, once you have those partnerships and the blended finance tools, it remains one key bottleneck to attract serious private sector money, and that's scale of investment opportunities. Unfortunately, very large investors will not even bother looking at a $50 million fund or $100 million fund, because that's exactly the type of tickets they are writing themselves into larger opportunities. And so what we're trying to innovate here is to actually bundle impact investing funds that we have structured with partners together, so that, and that's what we call the SDG 500, for a $500 million investment opportunity platform that is then capable of attracting $360 million of private sector money, protected by $140 million of public and private philanthropy money. And by doing that, first of all, we believe that we're providing a coherent framework for action for all the partners, for cross-learning, for cross-fertilization, even though each of the partners and each fund has its own strategy, seeking to address a specific problem, but the bundling gets us to scale in a coherent framework. And the beauty of it, we believe, and we'll see that in the future, is that this framework is actually replicable and scalable. So that's what we're trying to do at Bamboo today.
Yeah. So rather than having lots of disparate kind of investors happening in little silos, it's about getting everyone together and really going for it. Yeah, that's great.
And it's about bringing the best of the capabilities of every actor together and reinforcing each other's capabilities because of what we can bring to the table, as opposed to acting in silos. And that's what we've done so far, and that's very unfortunate.
Thanks, Jean-Philippe. Coming to you now, Christian, your company that you work for, ResponsAbility, I understand manages the investments of quite large institutions. So we're talking like big insurance companies, pension funds, people who have a lot of money to invest. And I'm curious to know, what are they looking for when they're looking to invest in an LDC business? And has COVID changed what they're prepared to invest in?
I think generally, so the demand for the sustainable and impact investing is still increasing when we talk to these private investors, as you mentioned, insurance companies, pension funds, or family offices, with the next generation taking over the family office. And they want to align their investments with their beliefs and values. So as Jean-Philippe mentioned already before, these investors normally want to deploy a large amount of money, so they prefer bigger investment funds and structure. And this is going to be difficult to provide these big fund structures in developing countries. I think, therefore, the majority of this sustainable and impact investing will still be in the developed countries. Well, I think these days a big topic, which is interesting for these private investors, is climate financing. And especially because of the Paris Climate Agreement, which wants to keep the global warming below 1.5% by 2050. And I think when it comes to climate, so far the agriculture sector has been neglected. But there was just recently a research paper launched with the lead of the University of Oxford that showed even if we stop all fossil fuel emission right now, just from the global food system alone, the temperature could raise by 1.5%. So if we just do business as usual. And I think, therefore, this opens new opportunities as well, maybe on a larger scale. And in order to bring down just the impact of these emissions from the agricultural sector, you need to increase productivity, reduce food waste, which is already or still 30%, so 30% until it gets on the shape, and you need to increase solar power productivity or solar powered warehouses. So it's really important, and I think especially for the LDCs, this could be a new topic when it comes to climate change and food system. But on the other hand, what is still the same, even before and after COVID, I mean, the private investors, they require market-based returns for the risk they're taking with their investment. So the private investors, they're normally not willing to give up on performance or return, so they want to kind of have a corresponding yield. And when it comes to the LDCs, most investors, they just have a global allocation to developing countries, so they're not engaging in single countries, because it's perceived to be risky investments in emerging markets or developing countries. And one way to reduce risk is that they seek for a broad diversification in terms of countries, region, and as well investee companies via financing. And what we see now because of COVID is that the private investors, they have postponed their investment decision. So they are waiting to have a clear picture on how the situation evolves in developing economies before they invest and commit. And I think what they did over the last months, they really did focus on the current investments. And COVID, even with us, they have shown us the difficulties we have. We had to increase provisionings, but we had as well positive examples like microfinance, even with this challenging year. It performs very well. It gives investors still a positive return, about 2%, together with a low correlation compared to listed bonds. And I think that's very powerful, and that is showing that this raises interest as well from the private sector to engage in these kind of investments like impact investing. But as mentioned before, the investor, they want to get paid for the risk taken. And sometimes these new investment topics like the food system change. They are riskier because there's no track record with this new approach or companies in the earlier stage. And therefore, I mean, Jean-Philippe mentioned it, blended finance or guarantees could be one solution to attract more private investors, because this concessional money or first loss money or kind of guarantee is providing additional level of protection for private investors, and hence reduces the risk and give them a kind of more assurance to be protected for such uncertain situations like we had in COVID-19.
Right, thank you, Christian. That's great to hear. Look, we're going to take some audience questions, and I've got a question here for you, Louise. Can you tell us a little bit about how, very briefly, how Rwanda has benefited from blended finance? Give us maybe an example where it relates to trade.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So yes, we definitely, as a country, have been able to benefit from this very innovative, model that we're seeing gain traction. And as Jean-Philippe mentioned, I think, we've really seen the huge potential, to do for this kind of financing to come in to de-risk projects, which has always been a major challenge for developing economies, which have a higher risk. Sometimes it's more of a perceived risk than anything. But it does have a huge potential to de-risk some of these projects and also crowd in or mobilize additional private sector investments. And a practical example that I could share from Rwanda's experience, in the sector that Christia spoke so passionately about, which is agriculture. We had a tripartite partnership between the government of Rwanda, Unilever, and the Wood Foundation Africa. And the partnership is focused on tea production. Tea is the main export crop for Rwanda. It's exported to more than 48 countries, and it's one of our top foreign exchange earners. So we signed this project in 2016. It has a massive, impact in terms of, development outcomes. It will create over 900 jobs. It has created over 900 jobs, employs about 2,000 casual workers. The 900 are permanent direct jobs. And then through smallholder, outgrower schemes, it's able to provide also income generating opportunities to over 6,000 farmers as well. So within the context of this agreement, Unilever comes in, a private, private sector player sourcing tea from the smallholder farmers. The Wood Foundation Africa was able to crowd in commercial and private funding to support smallholder farmers improve quality of the yields which they do supply to Unilever, and which really was a key driver for an investor like Unilever to be able to come in because of this kind of development support. And this support addressed the very key issues that I think Christia so eloquently spoke about. Providing some of it is financial assistance, some of it is technical assistance, in terms of technical advisory, as well as other extension services. So looking, and leveraging on all of these different synergies, as Jean-Philippe said, has really been impactful. We've been able to increase the incomes of smallholder farmers in remote areas where they would otherwise have had no means, or if any, very meager means to improve their livelihoods. But also at the same time, at an economic level, it has greatly boosted our export revenues. And because of the success of this, type of partnership, this blended partnership, we're currently finalizing negotiations with Unilever and the Wood Foundation to double the initial project size and add an additional 5,000 smallholder farmers, but also increase the processing capacity that Unilever has in this project. So from this example, I think you can see that there is really a lot of potential to maximize on the synergies between the private sector, government, the development community as well, to achieve sustainable impact.
Thanks, Louise. That's a really great example of what can happen when everyone works together, and that where public funds really can help to boost private sector investment and engagement. I've got a question here for you, Armin, from the audience. As a female co-founder, are there any specific challenges that you've faced as a woman in an investment space that's largely dominated by men?
Thank you for asking the question. So, well, I would like to start by citing an incident just a few months back. So a very well-respected senior female supporter of our startup ecosystem in Bangladesh, not me personally, and asked me to recommend female entrepreneurs for a new networking and investment platform she was launching for women entrepreneurs. I scouted through all my industry contacts and friends in the industry and could come up with only 5 names in the tech startup space. So that's 5 names out of a few hundred startups that are operating in the country now. Of course, when it comes to entrepreneurship in general, there are a lot more female entrepreneurs in small manufacturing, services and online business space than men, in Bangladesh at least, and also in India, I believe. But in terms of technology-based startups or the impact space, the number is still pretty dismal. In my case specifically, I have fortunately founded a startup in a female-focused space, something that was quite unexplored before. So since I was the person who came up with the entire concept and put together the whole business from scratch, I did kind of become the face of the business and had to present the business in front of investors and other platforms, something that I can say for sure that's not the case for the other female founders that I know in my country. But in spite of the inherent advantage that did come with leading a female-focused business, I did face a number of challenges that my male counterparts didn't doesn't have to face, some of which are very subtle. So the number one of this is networking. So the thing is, when I started, it was incredibly hard for me to even approach anyone on social media or through a cold email to introduce my business because of the inherent cultural perception in our country about women, that if you are approaching someone, you are thought of as arrogant or someone not very approachable. And initially, I wouldn't deny that I had noticed a number of male investors preferring to speak to my male co-founders regarding the details, whereas I was the CEO. So unknowingly, I have sort of accepted that. And I've also taken to kind of giving away the power to my male co-founders to speak to the ones who are just not comfortable speaking to me, just because I don't want to lose out on opportunities. So in addition, just because more than 95% of angel investors in our country are male, I have no way to interact with them socially or be introduced to them. So it means that my pool of potential investors who I can approach is much smaller than my male counterparts or the founders and co-founders of the other founders and co-founders. So networking and not being perceived as forthcoming or arrogant are the two biggest challenges that I've faced.
Wow, thanks, Amin. We really do need to do better to not only encourage women entrepreneurs, but to support them when they are stepping up into those leadership positions. So thank you for highlighting the challenges that you've faced, and no doubt that many other women entrepreneurs in LDCs do face. I would love to take more audience questions. We're going to do one more, and it's going to be a really quick one. It's directed to you, Jean-Philippe, and hopefully you can answer this in like 20 seconds. How are fees typically structured for impact fund managers? Is there an AUM fee plus carry? And maybe you can explain what those terms mean, because I don't know what those mean. Can you give it to me in 20 seconds?
Yes, I mean, typically, depending on whether you invest debt or equity, you have what is called a management fee. And that's the first part that covers the cost to operate the funds and to do the due diligence and monitor the investments and then exit those investments. That's number one. And then very often the manager is incentivized on the success of its investments by investors, and it is called carried interest if you do impact investing through equity. And then you can also be incentivized if you really do a good job in terms of lending money. And one trend I should mention is that very often now true real impact investors are tying their bonuses or their performance to not only financial returns, but also impact that they're generating, which means that you need to track them, you need to demonstrate them, you need to report on them. And if you indeed achieve set objectives that you set to yourself when you start investing with the intentionality I was mentioning at the beginning, then in the end, you're rewarded not only on the financial returns you bring to your investors, but also on the change that you have affected through your investments. I hope I answer your question.
Thanks so much, Jean-Philippe, and great job doing that briefly. So I would love to be able to take more of your questions, but unfortunately we're coming to the end of our time together today. And so before we do part, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share one key message, and we're gonna do it in 30 seconds or less. So this is a real exercise in succinct message delivery. So I'd love to hear from each of our panelists. What is one thing that our audience, whether that be LDC governments, ministries of trade, whether it's government investors, whoever you want to speak to, what's one thing that our audience can do right now to take advantage of innovative financing for trade? Let's start with you, Louise.
Thanks, Michelle. So I think just very quickly, it all starts with a strong vision, clear ownership. As I said, developing countries must have absolute clarity on what their development priorities are. From that point, you can then proactively reach out to attract and structure innovative financing that would be a good fit, in that it would be effective to helping you meet your development objectives. So vision, clarity, ownership, very important.
Amazing, and great example of a good succinct delivery of that message. I love it. Christian, what about you? What's your 30-second key message?
I think they should use already existing initiatives like ASELI or others, where they really tried to build up this kind of infrastructure, so lending to SME companies in these countries. So that they can invest in this agriculture financing, capacity building, financing value-added companies, the value chain, making project to make companies bankable. So they should use this kind of innovative financing in order to build this kind of infrastructure, to be able for institutional investors to invest.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. Min, what have you got for us?
So I think that when it comes to Bangladesh, we are already a lot ahead in terms of grant financing, because we have the biggest NGO in the world, actually. But when it comes to impact financing, the government still needs to foster a culture of open-mindedness and innovation when it comes to having the dialogues regarding this kinds of financing, because there's still a lot of regulatory and legal barriers that we entrepreneurs face when it comes to bringing this kinds of financing, or even having those kinds of options to have these kinds of financing for our businesses. Thank you.
Great message for LDC governments. Thank you, Armin. Jean-Philippe.
Well, very briefly, I will repeat, I think, what Louise has mentioned, and she hits on the three things I wanted to mention, not surprisingly. Number one is you provide an investment-friendly climate in your country, clear rules, free flow of capital. Number two, if you want to help focus investors on what is important and yet disseminate the impact to many, many smallholder farmers or small-scale companies, you work on aggregators and aggregation. And number three, you try to encourage entrepreneurship, and specifically tech entrepreneurship, because that's the future, and that's where private sector companies and investors like impact investors can then focus. And so those three key essential elements that Louise mentioned. And congratulations, by the way, for this.
Thank you so much. And to round us out, we're bringing back Yasmin. Yasmin, I'd love to hear your 30-second key message for an action right now that people could take.
So a couple of ideas to bring back resilience and responsiveness in the face of the crisis could be, first, to invest in preparedness, especially tailored to low-income and middle-income country contexts. The second would be to create incentives tailored to national systems to ensure concrete action on sustainability, equality, and inclusiveness. And the last would be to find ways to support local action as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to end on. And thank you all so much for your insights today. It's been a really wide-ranging and deep discussion. And I'm sure I speak for all of our audience when I say we just wish we had more time with you all. And on that note, our audience, we will be seeking to respond to those questions that you asked and that we didn't get time to via email after this event. So fear not, your questions will be answered by our amazing team at EIF. So thank you to our panelists. It's been so lovely to have you. And I'd like to come back to our audience because it's time for a closing final poll question, which hopefully should be appearing on your screen in a moment's. We hope that the conversation that we had today was more than just a conversation, but that it actually has inspired you perhaps to take some action. So if that is the case, please do let us know by responding to our poll now. And while we are waiting for your responses to come through, let's just check in with our graphic facilitator and see what has been captured from our event today. Can we spotlight onto our sketch, please?
I've been very busy.
Wonderful. This is great. And look, I think one of the reasons that we really wanted to do this, to offer this to the community, is that financing and trade can often be very abstract concepts that live in a very kind of in a space that's not as grounded in concrete and practical examples. And so we really wanted to illustrate for you all what the key takeaways are, and hopefully that you can share this with your colleagues in either in government or in the private sector, or with your peers as well. So this is a great, wow, it's too hard for even me to summarize in a few seconds, but look at all that. And we'll be sending this graphic through to you all after the event for you to take a closer look at. But I love that you've captured so many of the key messages here. Wonderful. So we'll go back to our poll now and see what follow-up actions you are all thinking that you might be able to take. I can see quite a few responses here about seeking to learn more, which is great because Violetta will tell you a very key way that EIF is going to be supporting you to learn more. And there's some great responses there, building relationships. Well, great, there's some people who wish to build relationships with investors, and well, if they're as great as Jean-Philippe and Christian sort of have explained, then I think that will be a great and fruitious way forward. And speaking to government colleagues about the importance of financing for trade, another big one, which is also very important to really build that capacity in country. So as we prepare to close the event today, and thank you for bearing with us as we ran a little over time, there was just too much juicy content to cut. I'd like to first welcome back my colleague Violetta. So Violetta, for our audience today who are from LDC governments or businesses, or who are impacting government investors rather, how can EIF support them to access some of the financing options that we've spoken about today?
Michelle, as you said, I think it's been a great day. We've had a very stimulating conversation, and I really hope that it's just one of many more to come in that journey to action. And it's great to see so many of you that are still online that responded to the poll that actually want to do something. So for us, I think for the EIF and for our partners today has really been essentially a call to action. And so I'd like to invite, for those of you watching, whether it's live or the recording, and you're either an LDC business or a government wanting and seeking investments into your country or your small business, reach out to EIF partnerships at WTO.org. And if you're a government investor, an impact investor trying to make a difference in LDCs, reach out to us as well. Part of the conversation today was really about building knowledge around a topic that deserves to be built in terms of new partnerships and sort of a better understanding of the topic at hand. So we are also really pleased at EIF to be releasing our first trade funding insight brief. It's part of a series of just trying to build that knowledge gap around the topic. And our first brief is actually dedicated to impact investment, which a lot of you have heard about quite substantially today. And it's being released tomorrow. So we invite you to keep building knowledge, keep building the conversations, and of course, to get in touch, reach out to us at eifpartnerships.org. As Michelle said, we'll also be getting in touch with you to answer all your questions. And thank you again, Michelle, for really a stimulating conversation today.
Thank you so much, Violetta. It was a great conversation. And I want to thank you and the whole EIF team for pulling this event together today. And a huge thanks to our partners at the OECD, the World Bank Group, Bamboo Capital Partners, and ResponsAbility Investments for making this event possible. And of course, thank you to you, our wonderful audience, for your time, your participation, for all the questions that you asked. We hope that today's event's given you the information and tools you need to take action. And as you exit this event, you'll be taken to a feedback survey. We would love if you could take a few minutes to give us your feedback. We take feedback very seriously and really do use it to ensure that we deliver events that meet your needs. So thank you all again, everyone, and good evening to you or good day to you.
Thanks, Michelle.